Does your commuter rail system have one line? That one line that just stands out from the rest of the system for one reason or another? Whether it be due to short length, low ridership, odd placement, or just straight up different. Well, I'm here to point out this line, go over its history, explain why it's so odd, and what can be done to fix it. All of this and more in this episode of Fixing Your Branch Line. Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Fixing Your Branch Line, the series where I casually call out a branch line for being somewhat different, go over its history and flaws, and suggest what can be done to fix it. After disqualifying Mark and shipping up to Boston, we'll be traveling north of the border to review our first Canadian railroad in the series, ALOEXO, also known as Réseau des Transports Métropolitains, or RTM, and formerly known as AMT. Okay, first off, I would like to state that I am not French, nor do I have any experience in speaking French whatsoever, so I would like to sincerely apologize ahead of time for the countless French names that I'll likely horribly mispronounce throughout the video. Please don't dislike or unsubscribe for that reason. Thanks. Now back to the main purpose of this video. Unlike any of the previous episodes, this agency is not affiliated with the city's larger public transit agency that also provides bus and subway services, or only buses depending on who you ask because of the rubber-wheeled metro. And yet it just makes a requirement at 5 commuter rail lines and has 2 main bus corridors that, wait a minute, they beat commuter rail ridership by how much? Like the last episode, the system is divided into 2 unofficial segments. The former Canadian Pacific branch line starting at Windsor or Lucien-l'Allier station, and the former Canadian National branch line starting at Montreal Central station. Throughout the many rebrandings of EXO over the years, the commuter services are now given line numbers 11 through 15. The fully electrified Du Montages line, or line 16, being lost from the system by being converted into a branch of the REM Metro, or Réseau Express Métropolitain, and their MR90 EMUs have all been retired and scrapped as a result. Thankfully, one example in preservation. Anyways, as indicated by the intro, one would naturally expect the Condillac line to be covered, but upon further research and a variety of historically significant past and current events, I decided to shift my focus to a former CN branch line that recently got truncated at a suburb on the outskirts of Montreal due to the development of a relatively popular metro system and has one of the craziest new build connections to part of a nearby branch line. Oh yes, we're talking about the Mascouche line. This EXO branch is the newest one in the system with a start date of 2014, the only branch that's partially electrified and therefore the newest heavy rail electrification project in Canada. Is the reason why EXO has Bombardier ALP45s and multi-levels, now their most common fleet, runs through multiple Canadian national freight yards and spurs, shares trackage with 2 tri-weekly Via Rail branch lines, goes back and forth between single and double-tracked right-of-ways, and jumps from a CN secondary to a short line branch through a single-tracked highway median with sharp curves. Fittingly, the present-day incarnation of this branch has an equally confusing and sporadic history, so without further ado, let's begin the story of Montreal's abnormal branch line. Right off the bat, when attempting to search this line's history, the trusty Rail Guide app very unusually shows no original owner for the line between Onstick and Pointe-aux-Trembles, as well as no present-day trackage for the new build segment, so you can already sense the sketchy vibes that this branch is giving off. Likewise, after days of research just to reassure this truth, this line wasn't in fact built until as recent as 1943, as a connection to the newly opened Montreal Central Station via the Mount Royal Tunnel for Rawdon and Rivière-à-Pierre bound trains, operated by Canadian National, thus making this line one of the most recently built heavy rail routes in Canada. Like many underground rail hubs, Montreal Central Station had a rule that prohibited steam and diesel engines from running through the Mount Royal tunnels due to no ventilation, so overhead wires were extended to St. Leonard and Montreal Nord for electric engines to tow trains into Montreal Station. CN also had a rush hour commuter service along the electrified portion of the line in 1946, a 10-mile-long service with an electric engine and a few coaches in tow, in order to connect the various towns on the outskirts of central Montreal. Although, this commuter run never became too popular due to its once-a-day frequency, as the run was discontinued in 1968, and CN's intercity passenger rail operations would be transferred to the also government-owned Via Rail 10 years later. Although Via Rail trains heading to the rest of Quebec and Ottawa would continue to be pulled by an electric CN engine through the Mount Royal Tunnel. Meanwhile, parts of the route would be considered as one of many alternative routes for an air train service to Mirabel Airport that was cancelled due to lack of funding in 1977, as well as a light rail line known as Line 6, or Metro Regional, from Deux College to Pointe-aux-Trembles in 1979, but this was rejected in favor of Line 5, or the Blue Line subway. The line would see temporary commuter service between May and October of 1990 with the Metropolitan train between Du College and Repentigny as an alternative when Autoroute 40 was being rebuilt, as this service was being offered by STCOM, the agency in charge of the Montreal Metro, before the commuter rail service was spun off into AMT in 1997. Now we run into the first of two significant rebuilds for the Mountain Royal tunnels, as they will be rebuilt in 1995 to accommodate AMT's commuter rail service to Deux-Montages, which forced Via Rail trains to detour past CN's intermodal yard to this day. Yet there was still enough clearance for diesel and bi-level coaches to fit in the tunnels as need be, as AMT used these dimensions and anti-diesel regulations to their advantage to purchase a huge order to replace their aging equipment. In a press conference in 2006, AMT announced intentions to reintroduce commuter rail service to eastern Montreal and nearby suburbs with swing voters by using dual-mode locomotives that ran on overhead wire on a newly electrified branch to Ansnick, and on diesel for the rest of the route. This line would finally be AMT's missing Route 5, as this mighty new service will be known as the Repentigny Mascouche line. But wait a minute, the original CN service never went to Mascouche. How is this line going from one densely populated swing burb to the other? Don't worry, we'll cover that later. In order to fulfill the dual mode requirement of the line, AMT joined New Jersey Transit for a joint order of Bombardier ALP-45s, as AMT ordered a total of 20 engines which, despite being made by a Canadian company, were shipped from their Kassel, Germany plant, thus making them a handful of Canadian engines that weren't built in North America. Likewise, AMT also joined NJT on a slightly later joint order of multi-level coaches and cab cars, also made by Bombardier, but this time built closer to home at their Plattsburgh, New York plant, and are the only AMT equipment to have two sets of 5-chime horns on top of each other instead of side by side, which I feel looks much more cool in my opinion. Originally estimated at $300 million and expected to open in 2008, the line eventually costed $670 million and opened in 2014, with 5 new stops between Montreal Nord and Mascouche, along with new stops being added in Pointe aux Trembles and Sauve a year later, the latter of which was opened for better connections to the Montreal Metro's Orange Line. But that very same year, a rapid transit proposal would jeopardize the routing and partial electrification of the Mascouche line by bringing forth the second major rebuilding program of the Mount Royal Tunnel. This system was the ever so popular Réseau Express Métropolitain, simply known as the RAM, which proposed assuming the entire AMT Deux-Montages line as one of its branches, and therefore took the Mount Royal tunnels with it, as its rebuild would not make the existing rolling stock compatible with the tunnels, or the autonomous train technology installed in the line. Then in 2017, AMT was split into ARTM, who controlled fares and planning for Montreal public transit agencies, and Allo-Exo, who continued to operate Montreal's commuter services with a late and relatively slow ongoing rebranding process, but operations would continue as normal for the most part. That is, until construction officially started for REM in 2018, as the Deux-Montages line would be closed for reconstruction in 2020, and Mascouche Line's trains lost its 2 Mount Royal stations as rush hour trains were forced to detour around CN's Montreal yard in order to reach Central Station, with diesel-exclusive F-59s now being spotted on the route, with regular service truncating at Ansnick, and future service planned to terminate at a new REM transfer station called Côte de Liège, thus making the Mascouche line the only isolated route of the EXO system. Despite having great connections and frequencies for the rest of the city, the construction of REM directly hoodwinked this recently opened EXO branch line from direct access to Montreal's downtown, and opened the floor of commuter versus rapid rail debate, along with several planning issues which makes an ultimate antidote almost impossible to obtain. But before we dive deeper into this REM versus EXO debate, I feel it's time to answer the segment you've been waiting for, namely on the opposite end of the route and its namesake terminus for the line. It's time to review the creative, the questionable, Mascouche connection.
Wait just 1 minute, Penzi. I've been waiting long enough to be included in a video ever since you dropped the hint in the Bicentennial Units video that was released, almost 2 months ago at this rate?
Oh, sorry about that, Cal Unit Productions. I just had to get the series premiere of Unbuilt released first since that took weeks to make.
Well, alright then. Better late than never, I suppose. As stated earlier, I am here to finally fulfill my guest appearance on this channel. And what better way to appear than one that focuses on a former Canadian National line? Starting off from the REM construction, the line immediately ends its 1 mile long overhead electrification spur from the Mount Royal line at Ossining, as the main line goes from 2 tracks to 1. After passing the CP-owned St. Jerome line and some more single track stations, the line becomes double track at St. Leonard in Montreal Nord, which has a huge overpass to an eastern platform that's oddly only a third of the length of the western platform. The next station, Gare d'Anjou, also shares this platform, and after some CN freight spurs, we eventually pass the relatively large Rivière des Prairies classification yard, where most of the local freight on this line is sorted. After the comparatively tiny Rivière des Prairies station, with yet another short platform on the south end, we reach the recently opened Pointe aux Trembles, where the short south end platform connects to the parking lot, while the northern end has an incredibly long overpass that goes from the platform to street level that doesn't even connect to the parking lot, which could be easily avoided by smoothing out the former roadway access grade to the platform, or by using the almost hidden trail that connects the far end of the platform to a nondescript dead end. I mean, if you're going to have an overpass, at least connect it to the other side of the station so that people don't have to walk all the way around. Right after this, the line goes past a single-track bridge that passes by where the original CN line used to be, along with remnants of a Y to the existing line, as it goes onto a single-track bridge and crosses the Prairies River into Repentany's high-level station, which, despite having one platform, at least has an overpass that connects to the parking lot. So honestly, good job on this one. Now, for the moment you've been waiting for. Instead of traveling north into L'Assomption and beyond, the Mascouche line quickly ducks under a boulevard, goes into a 3/4 mile long shelter to protect the line from a nearby munitions plant, then jumps right into the median of Autoroute 640 and quickly stops at the high-level Gare Terrebonne station that serves an adjacent suburb, and then continues to run down the Autoroute median for 4 miles before making an incredibly sharp 64-degree curve onto the former Canadian Pacific line that is now owned by the Quebec-Gatineau short line, before finally coming to an end at the high-level Mascouche station and adjacent yard. Yikes, talk about one complex branch line. Welp, I did as much as I could for this guest appearance, and as always, be sure to check out my channel as well. Anyways, back to you, Pensy fan.
Thanks for helping out. Now back to the other end of this route. As great as REM is for serving dense parts of Montreal with frequent metro service, in the case of EXO Access, I'm sorry to say, they pulled a Patco. They built a metro line right on top of an existing heavy rail right-of-way, which forces the commuter service to either make a much longer detour around the city to access the terminus station, or to truncate at a station much further away from the city's downtown, and drastically lose ridership because of it. Such a truncation of service ultimately led to the Atlantic City line to be discontinued in the early 80s due to how unpopular a daily transfer was, until direct rerouted service to Philly was brought back a few years later. Although, there's an article from La Presse from a few years ago that describes this issue, which mentions that the same politicians who wanted the service to be extended to Mascouche in the first place want some sort of compatibility with REM, based on its popularity. So before the transfer station at Côte de Liesse is open, most Mascouche line trains terminate at Annecy, with 3 rush hour trains continuing on to Montreal Central Station through a 30 to 50 minute long detour that goes around CN's intermodal facility all the way in Lachine. Frequencies are decent with a 7 out of 10 rating with 1 train every 30 minutes during rush hours, but then becomes disorganized with 1 train every 4 hours, which shows that there's at least some attempt of running service outside of rush hours. I also don't cover fare zones on these videos since they're subject to change, but as soon as a line leaves Montreal Island and onto historically new trackage, it jumps right to Fare Zone 3 from Fare Zone 1, so I just find that a bit odd. But other than questionable swing urban routing, the addition of REM causes shiny happy people to make inconvenient transfers with strange currencies, and everybody hurts when the one they love is truncated outside the central region and makes them ask what the frequency is, which causes people to drive as they're losing their religion and believe it's the end of the world as we know it, due to route changes that can be seen by a man on the moon. Oh come on, I had to at least make some REM jokes in this video. It's too obvious to miss. Over the past few episodes in this great series, this route is undoubtedly the hardest route I've attempted to fix, since I have considered a large number of possible solutions to improve this line, and all of them have been blocked by one factor or another. But basically, all of them are rooted in having direct service to Montreal Central Station, or at least somewhere within central Montreal, since truncating service on an outer suburb would most likely hurt the line's ridership. I've considered rerouting the line onto the St. Jerome line and having the service end at Lucien-l'Allier station, but a massive power line blocks the already tight area where the connecting track would be, and the orientation of wires and electricity for the area might have to be adjusted and recalculated accordingly, albeit this would require the least amount of work when compared to other proposals. The next proposal is to simply build a new REM line to Pentony or Mascouche, but doing yet another PATCO would have an even greater impact due to the multiple active freight spurs and yards along the line, and it would also block the existing tri-weekly via rail service to Enrique and Saint-Terre. Building a preferably double-tracked REM line adjacent to the existing trackage would be the next ideal possibility, but this is highly unlikely due to the already limited space near the tracks, and building an entirely new line either above or below the existing tracks would involve incredibly expensive and lengthy construction, which could also result in temporary shutdowns for existing service. Another option is to replace commuter service with a Montreal subway extension, but this was quickly discarded since there are currently no subway routes directly adjacent to the Mascouche line, and such an extension would be extremely far from the rest of the metro system. The last option is to simply keep the existing reroute for all trains to Central Station, which is the most unlikely since the transfer station is already being constructed, and the detour would add up to 15 minutes for each trip in between Onsiche and Central Station, when compared to 10 minutes with the REM transfer. With all these possibilities in mind, and after giving this a lot of thought, my official antidote for the Mascouche line is to keep 2 direct trains to Central Station. As much as I'd hate to admit this, there really isn't any other primary way to improve the Mascouche line, as it is, other than to transfer to the REM, due to much quicker travel times to Central City than the existing detour. Hopefully this will also bring an increase of frequencies along the remaining branch north of the transfer station due to shorter distance. But all I ask for is at least 1 or maybe 2 direct trains from Mascouche to Central Station using the current detour for commuters who prefer to have a 1-seat ride and don't particularly mind about a longer travel time. As for the northern end of the line, I'd like to propose rerouting this line onto pre-existing CN trackage and extending service to the Epiphéenne or even the line's original terminus at Raudon, with an exact ROW to be determined later, and having a new commuter branch splitting from the St. Jerome line along the Quebec-Gatineau to Mascouche and the Epiphéenne as a redundant but direct service to the center of the city, so I honestly don't feel the wild highway median connection is necessary for one stop on a line that eventually meets up with the CN line just a few miles north. With these many proposals having varying levels of success and hurdles, I hope that this soon-to-be isolated service continues to upkeep at least a decent number of ridership due to better transfers to REM, as the outer suburbs not only have the population, but also the hopes of having frequent, REM-like service further from the city. Just hear me out when it comes to direct but longer service to Central Station. You know, as soon as I found out that EXO was also the name of a K-pop band, I tried to include their song names as a joke like I did with REM earlier, but I don't think I could really do that easily with these song titles, which fittingly describes my experience of trying to determine an official anecdote for this branch. Considering the Condillac line was the only unofficial advertising for this specific episode by being included in the intro, I might as well cover it as an honorable mention, since the branch line's order was going to be reversed, with the Mascouche line intended to be the honorable mention. Focusing on a Canadian Pacific branch line instead of Canadian National, the Condillac line has its origins in CP's St. John's, New Brunswick main line opened in 1887. That would take intercity and long-distance trains from Montreal across Maine and into St. John's, before being transferred to a Canadian National train to Halifax, rather unusual considering the two railroads were fierce rivals. Not too long after the line was built, CP introduced commuter service on the line between Farnham and Montreal-Windsor Station, currently Lucien-l'Allier Station, but without the hockey arena on top. And this service surprisingly ran all the way until 1980, just 2 years before CP transferred their only remaining commuter services to Dorian to AMT. Commuter service wouldn't be restored on the line for another 20 years, when AMT introduced service to Delson in 2001, and then extended one stop to Condillac in 2005. Throughout its renewed service life, this branch was home to a wide variety of leased train sets and engines, along with GP9Us, leased F40 PHRs and F59 PHIs, and exclusively single-level equipped such as the EXCO Transit Hawker Sidleys and Bombardier 700 series coaches until their retirement less than a year ago. Frequencies are rated at a 6.5 out of 10, with most trains being ran during the rush hour and a few less afterwards, with this line also jumping from fare zone A to C after crossing the St. Lawrence River. The line itself is double-tracked until Delson and Condillac, as it leaves the CP main from Lucien-l'Allier at Montreal West, with Duke now having a much shorter west end platform, then passes over the St. Lawrence River and a place named Osha Park. St. Catherine Station has a platform on one side of the station. St. Constant is located next to this little place called the Canadian Railway Museum, which has incredibly tight curves on its loop. The Delson station is located further back from the original depot that saw service not only from CP's main line, but also a Canadian National secondary to Massena, New York, and the Naperville Junction Railway, which operated Delaware and Hudson trains in Canada. And the mighty terminus of the station of this branch has a box. That's it. A 46-foot-long slab of concrete that only holds half a car and, despite being made in 2005, isn't even ADA accessible, with a stairway being built instead of a large ramp. This branch does seem to do a good job connecting nearby suburbs and transit-oriented developments, as new housing groups were built at St. Catharines Station, with similar plans currently underway to overdevelop the terminus at Condillac. Although there's one glaringly obvious problem. The Condillac station is nowhere to be found in any of these renderings, so hopefully that station is to be rebuilt at some point, with the final design to be determined at a later date. A study was also made to extend the line to St. Jean-sur-Richelieu and St. Philippe in 2014, but this was ultimately rejected due to longer travel times, which I feel could be solved with higher speeds in between the last two stops, since the area between the two towns is pretty much farmland. However, choosing a good terminus station isn't as easy as the Mascouche line, since there aren't any current intercity rail services to transfer to. So my official antidote for this branch would be express service to Farmville, so that it can skip some of the later local stops and connect relatively large towns outside of Montreal to the city. I suggest express service in particular since it's a further distance to be covered, and Go Transit recently tried something similar a few years ago, in which they operated a much longer pilot service to London, Ontario from Kitchener, and such a service could see more success in Farnham due to a shorter total distance and runtime, along with there being no other passenger rail service in the area. Another option is to extend the REM to Condillac or Delson, but that would drain the Condillac line its ridership, and extending it even further to run as a loop service of sorts wouldn't be feasible due to limited space along the existing right-of-way. You could also extend the Condillac line up to St. Lambert's and run a loop service around Montreal, but then you would also have the issue of trying to connect Central Station with Monsieur-l'Allier. Despite the relatively short length of the existing service, increased frequencies and small infrastructure improvements such as sidings can help bring forth a new era in commuter railroading through longer express services that can quickly connect outer towns to city centers at almost any time of the day. Thank you all for watching this episode of Fixing Your Branch Line. I have to say, this has definitely been one of the toughest episodes to make an official antidote for, since it was quite discouraging to see every alternative that I can come up with be proven wrong by one thing or another. But nevertheless, it's always good to come together and share these ideas to begin with, as they can be further developed to help solidify existing plans, raise concerns about impacts for other services, or develop future ideas that might not appear obvious at first. Especially the power line relocation. If an engineer can get back to me with that calculation, that would be great. Special thanks to Cal Unit Productions for making a long-awaited guest appearance in this video, and for providing rolling line footage to describe the Mascouche line, highway median connection, as well as for pronouncing most of the town names much better than I can. Thank you again for watching. Credit for all the photos used go to their respective photographers, and if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Have a good day.